When the United States moved against Maduro, it looked like a clear show of force, but then China said one word: illegal. And suddenly, the question wasn't about Venezuela anymore. It was about who still controls the rules of the global system, because what happened next was not a military confrontation. It was not a diplomatic standoff in the traditional sense. It was something far more subtle and far more dangerous. It was the moment when the entire world realized that the United States, for all its aircraft carriers and all its economic sanctions and all its moral authority, had walked into a trap of its own making. A trap where every move forward makes the situation worse. A trap where retreat looks like defeat. And a trap that was set not by Maduro, not by the Venezuelan military, but by Beijing. Quietly, patiently, years in advance. Let me take you back to understand how this trap was built. Because this story does not start with Maduro. It does not start with Chavez. It starts with a decision made in the quiet offices of the Chinese Communist Party sometime in the early 2000s. A decision that most Western analysts completely missed because they were too busy watching tanks and missiles and military parades. The decision was this: China would build a new kind of empire, not through conquest, not through colonies, but through debt, through infrastructure, through the patient construction of dependencies that would be invisible until the moment they mattered. Venezuela was one of the first laboratories for this model. When Hugo Chavez came to power and began his loud theatrical campaign against American imperialism, most people saw theater, but Beijing saw opportunity. Because Chavez was not just angry at Washington, he was desperate. Venezuela's economy, for all its oil wealth, was structurally fragile. The state oil company was inefficient. The infrastructure was decaying. And Chavez needed money fast to fund his social programs and keep his political coalition intact. The International Monetary Fund would have demanded reforms. The World Bank would have imposed conditions. But China asked for only one thing: oil. And so the loans began. Billions of dollars. Structured not as traditional loans, but as oil-for-loan agreements. China would lend money up front. Venezuela would repay not in cash, but in barrels of crude. Delivered every month, for years, at prices locked in by contract. To Western economists, this looked like a bad deal for China. Because oil prices fluctuate. Because Venezuela's state oil company was notoriously corrupt and unreliable. Because lending to a government as erratic as Chavez's seemed insane. But China was not thinking like a bank. China was thinking like a strategist. What China understood, and what Washington missed, was that these loans were not really about profit. They were about leverage. Once Venezuela owed China tens of billions of dollars, once the repayment structure was locked into oil shipments, once Chinese engineers and Chinese firms became embedded in the Venezuelan energy sector, something fundamental changed. Venezuela was no longer fully sovereign, not in the legal sense, but in the practical sense. Because any decision Venezuela made, any political shift, any attempt to realign itself geopolitically, now had to account for the fact that Beijing held the keys to its economy. By the time Nicolas Maduro inherited power in 2013, this structure was fully operational. Venezuela owed China more than $60 billion. Chinese firms operated the ports where Venezuelan oil was loaded. Chinese banks held the contracts that kept the refineries running. And every month, tankers filled with Venezuelan crude sailed east, not west. This was the trap. And Maduro, incompetent and brutal as he was sitting right in the middle of it. Now fast forward to the present. The United States decides it has had enough. Maduro is a dictator. The economy has collapsed, millions have fled. And Washington, under pressure from the Venezuelan diaspora and from hawks in both parties, decides to act. The justification is framed carefully. Not regime change, not democracy promotion, but law enforcement. Maduro is indicted on charges of narco-terrorism, an international warrant, a clear legal framework. This is not an invasion. This is justice. And for a moment, it looked like it would work. Because Maduro's government is weak, his military is fractured, his people despise him. The opposition has international recognition. The stage seemed set for a clean operation. Arrest Maduro, install a transitional government, restore democracy, move on. But then Beijing spoke. Not loudly, not with threats, just one word. Illegal. That single word changed everything. Because what Beijing was doing was not defending Maduro. Beijing does not care about Maduro. What Beijing was doing was defending the principle that the United States cannot simply arrest foreign leaders whenever it decides that domestic law justifies it. Because if the United States can do that to Maduro, it can do that to anyone. It can do that to leaders in Africa who have signed infrastructure deals with China. It can do that to leaders in Southeast Asia who have accepted Chinese loans. It can do that to anyone who steps outside the American sphere of influence and tries to build an alternative. And here is where the trap closes. Because now Washington faces an impossible choice. If it proceeds with the operation, it validates Beijing's narrative. It proves to the entire global South that the so-called rules-based international order is just a cover for American power. That sovereignty only matters if you are aligned with Washington. That the United States will use its legal system, its intelligence agencies, its military, to remove any leader it dislikes, regardless of what international law actually says. Every country watching will draw the same conclusion. We need an alternative. We need a system that protects us from this, and the only country offering that alternative is China. But if Washington backs down, if it does not follow through, it looks weak. It looks like China can veto American actions in the Western Hemisphere. It looks like Beijing's client states are untouchable. And that sends an equally dangerous message. That Chinese patronage is more powerful than American pressure. That if you align yourself with Beijing, you are safe. That the era of American dominance in its own backyard is over. This is the trap. And it was set years ago, not through military force, not through diplomatic threats, but through the patient construction of a structure where any American move creates a problem that is worse than the problem it was meant to solve. Now, let's talk about why this trap works. Because the genius of China's strategy is not that it prevents American action. It is that it makes American action counterproductive. Think about what happens if the United States successfully removes Maduro. You get a power vacuum. You get a transitional government that is weak and divided. You get a country that is economically destroyed and politically unstable. And most importantly, you get a country that still owes China $60 billion. So what happens to that debt? Does the new government repay it? With what money? Venezuela's economy is in ruins. Its oil production has collapsed. It would take years, maybe decades, to rebuild the infrastructure necessary to pump oil at the levels needed to service those loans. So the debt sits there, unpaid, unserviceable. And Beijing, patient as ever, simply waits. Because China is not in a hurry. China does not need the money back next year. China is playing a 30-year game. And what China knows is that eventually, whoever governs Venezuela will have to come to Beijing and renegotiate. And when that negotiation happens, Beijing will have leverage. Because Venezuela will need investment. It will need technology. It will need expertise to restart its oil sector. And the only country that has already spent 15 years learning how Venezuela's oil infrastructure works, the only country that has engineers who know the fields and the pipelines and the refineries, is China. So even if Maduro falls, even if a pro-American government takes power, that government will still be dependent on Beijing. The trap doesn't close on Maduro, it closes on whoever comes next. This is what Washington is beginning to realize, that removing Maduro does not solve the problem, it just changes the face of the problem. Because the real issue is not Maduro. The real issue is that Venezuela has been structurally integrated into a Chinese economic system, and you cannot undo that integration with an arrest warrant. But here is the deeper layer. The reason this trap is so effective is not just because of Venezuela, it is because of what Venezuela represents. Venezuela is a prototype. It is a demonstration project. It is Beijing showing the rest of the world what Chinese backing looks like. And the message is simple. If you align with us, we will protect you. Not with aircraft carriers, not with military bases, but with something more powerful, with economic dependency that makes it too costly for the United States to remove you. Look at what is happening in Africa. Chinese loans have built ports in Djibouti, railways in Kenya, highways in Ethiopia. And every one of those projects comes with the same structure. Loans backed by resources, long-term contracts, Chinese firms embedded in critical infrastructure. And now, when the United States or the IMF or the World Bank tries to pressure these governments, tries to demand reforms or transparency or human rights improvements, these governments have an out. They can say no, because they have an alternative source of funding, and that alternative does not care about governance or democracy or press freedom. It only cares about repayment. And repayment is structured in a way that makes the relationship permanent. This is the new imperialism, and it is far more effective than the old kind. Because the old imperialism was visible. It required soldiers and governors and occupation. It created resistance. It created nationalist movements. It was expensive and unstable. But this new model is invisible. It looks like development. It looks like partnership. And by the time you realize you are trapped, the infrastructure is built, the debt is owed, and the dependency is complete. Now back to Venezuela, because the reason Beijing said illegal was not to save Maduro. It was to send a signal to every other government that is currently weighing whether to take Chinese money. The signal is this: we will protect you. Not perfectly, not militarily, but enough. Enough that the United States cannot simply remove you without cost. Enough that Washington will have to think twice. Enough that the risk of aligning with us is lower than the risk of refusing us. And this is where the American trap deepens, because Washington's traditional tools no longer work the way they used to. Sanctions? Venezuela has been under sanctions for years, and Maduro is still there. Why? Because China keeps the economy on life support, just enough oil revenue flowing, just enough spare parts arriving, just enough hard currency circulating to keep the regime afloat. Diplomatic isolation? Venezuela is already isolated from the West. But it is not isolated from China, from Russia, from Iran, from the dozen other countries that are building an alternative bloc. Military intervention? Possible. But incredibly risky, because even though China does not have military bases in Venezuela, even though Chinese soldiers are not going to fight American soldiers, the political cost of an invasion in the Western Hemisphere in the 21st century would be catastrophic. It would unite the global South against the United States. It would validate every narrative about American imperialism. It would hand Beijing the greatest propaganda victory in decades. So Washington is stuck. It cannot act without making things worse. It cannot retreat without looking weak. And every day that Maduro remains in power, every day that Beijing's model is seen to work, more countries are drawn toward the Chinese system. not because they love China, not because they trust China, but because they see that Chinese backing offers something that American backing does not: protection from American coercion. This is the paradox. The more the United States tries to assert its dominance, the more it drives countries toward China. The more it uses sanctions and arrest warrants and legal pressure, the more it proves that the American-led order is not rules-based, but power-based. And that realization is exactly what China needs to build its alternative. Now let's talk about what this means for the future. Because Venezuela is not unique. It is a template, and Beijing is replicating this template across the global South, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, in Latin America. Everywhere that American influence is contested, China is offering the same deal: loans for infrastructure, debt for resources, dependency for protection. And the trap is the same. By the time Washington realizes what is happening, the structure is already built. And here is the uncomfortable truth. The United States does not have a counter-strategy. It has rhetoric, it has warnings about debt traps, it has initiatives with names like Build Back Better World or the Blue Dot Network. But it does not have the money. It does not have the state capacity. It does not have the willingness to write the same kind of long-term, no-strings-attached checks that Beijing writes. Because American money comes with conditions: democracy, governance, transparency, environmental standards, and those conditions, however well-intentioned, make American money slower, harder to access, and more politically costly for the governments that take it. So when a leader in Africa or Latin America is deciding where to get funding for a port or a railway or a power plant, the choice is clear. Take American money and spend 3 years navigating bureaucracy and conditions, or take Chinese money and break ground next month. The choice is not about values. It is about speed. And speed matters when you are trying to stay in power. This is why Beijing's model is winning. Not because it is morally superior, not because it offers a better future, but because it offers a faster path to the infrastructure that developing countries desperately need. And once that infrastructure is built, once the debt is owed, once the dependency is established, it is almost impossible to undo. Venezuela shows what happens at the end of that process. You get a country that is economically destroyed but politically resilient. A country where the government is hated but cannot be removed. A country where American pressure is constant but ineffective. And a country where China, quietly, patiently, continues to extract value. So when Beijing said illegal, it was not making a legal argument. It was making a strategic statement. The statement was this: we have built a system that you cannot break. You can arrest leaders. You can impose sanctions. You can freeze assets. But you cannot undo the dependencies we have created. And every time you try, you prove to the rest of the world that they need an alternative to you. This is the new Cold War. And it is not being fought with missiles. It is being fought with loans, with infrastructure, with the patient construction of a parallel system that allows countries to survive outside American influence. And Venezuela is the proof that this system works, not because Maduro is strong, but because the structure that keeps him in power is stronger than anything Washington can deploy against it. The trap is complete, and the United States is inside it. Every move it makes now is a choice between bad options: act and validate Beijing's narrative, retreat and confirm Beijing's power. The only way out is to build a better alternative, to offer a model of development that is faster, cheaper, and more reliable than China's. But that would require a fundamental rethinking of how American power works. It would require patience, It would require investment. It would require accepting that influence in the 21st century is not built through coercion, but through construction. And that is the one thing the American system, with its short election cycles and its political polarization and its decreasing appetite for long-term foreign engagement, seems unable to do. So the trap remains. And Venezuela is just the beginning.